So, good evening, and thank you for coming out on not the easiest night of the year to come. And I know this is being live streamed, so I want to greet the people who are at home and watching. And is this on? No. Okay. All right now? Okay. Okay. So, again, thank you for coming, and greetings to all who are watching this on live stream. And so let me begin by saying why I chose this topic. It's partly because I've taught the issue of the ethics of war for over 50 years, and it is a strange and in many ways depressing fact that we have two major conflicts going on at the same time, and both of them are not only local or regional, they have global implications. So it did seem to me that a church that has talked about war and peace for over 1,500 years, we have to resort not only to political and moral analysis of war, but remember that war is always to be judged morally. And so it's in that sense that the two wars, of course, that I'll attend to are the war that is presently going on between Russia and the Ukraine, and then the war in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians. The moral framework to which I refer is a moral framework drawn from Catholic moral teaching. So what I will do is the following. I want to begin by talking about how you think and talk about the ethics of war. Secondly, I want to say something about the return of what is today called great power politics. Thirdly, we'll try a moral analysis, a snapshot of the two wars. Fourthly, say something about the impact of these two wars on U.S. domestic life. And then finally, an assessment looking at Pope Francis and looking also at U.S. policy in these two conflicts. So first, how do you think about war in moral terms? It's a reasonable response to say, is it even possible? And that is a response that has been made throughout the ages. Perhaps the most well-used book on this topic, The Ethics of War, the most well-used book in the United States, is the book by Professor Michael Walzer of the Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. His book is now more than 40 years old, but continues to be used. And Walzer says himself, war is the hardest case. And what he means by that is when you are trying to discipline power, direct power by moral principles, war is the most difficult case. If you can do it there, it is likely we can do it in other places where moral principle needs to guide power in a world that is filled with various kinds of power. Now, if you ask how have people tried to think about ethics and war, historically, there are three basic positions. They all admit of a certain pluralism within these three positions, but to set the stage, let me just try to summarize each of the positions. The first position, in a sense, is the one that sees very little possibility to combine morality and war. It is the pacifist or nonviolent position. It's a philosophical position. It's a position that is grounded in religious traditions also. And its essential statement is that it is not possible to morally justify the purposeful taking of human life. And so pacifism has an absolute rule. It becomes almost a way of life for those who hold this position, because it is not an easy position to hold to, especially when conflicts begin and passions run high. To take the absolute position that all use of force is morally wrong is a difficult position to sustain. Nonviolence is not quite the same as pacifism in this sense. Nonviolence is a philosophy again and a set of tactics. And the reason I distinguish the two is because you can find people who use the tactics of nonviolence in the midst of political conflict or even in the midst of war, but they are not themselves strictly pacifists. So, for example, people in South Africa who opposed the apartheid regime, for example, you would find people who held to a position of nonviolence, but if you ask them, were they an absolute pacifist, the answer was no. You saw some of the same thing in Eastern Europe under communist rule, a similar kind of distinction. So a first position, and I'll say a word on how it relates to the Catholic position in a few moments. At the other end of the spectrum from pacifism and nonviolence, there's the position that's called classical realism. This is not a religiously grounded position. It is a philosophical position, a political position, and classical realism is rooted long ago in the history of the West. So, for example, an example of classical realism at work is Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars. In that you will find Thucydides saying that the strong do what they will and the weak do what they must. And essentially, classical realism translates into a position that when wars are fought, interests are at stake, but there is hardly any room for moral restraint on those interests. This is a position that is widely held in societies, particularly when conflict begins. To say that a classical realist has no room for morality would be an overstatement. There have been people who hold this position, people very well known in American society as realists, but they had room for moral restraint. But the position in its pure form tends to relegate morality to an aspiration, but not a restraining force on the use of force. Between these two positions, there is what has historically been known as the just war, just defense position. So if the pacifist position says that all uses of force are morally wrong, and the realist position in its pure form says don't even ask the question about moral restraint, this middle position says some uses of force are morally acceptable, but not all uses of force are morally acceptable. This position has been the dominant position of the Catholic Church since the 5th century. But as in so many other things in the life of the Church today, Pope Francis has his own way of addressing these questions. And I would say Francis places himself someplace between a pure pacifist position and the just war position. Francis's response to war almost always is that all war is a defeat for everyone. In other words, there is no moral purpose that can be fulfilled by resorting to war. When he is pressed, in some cases, and he has been pressed in his responses to both Ukraine and Russia on the one hand, and Israel and the Palestinians on the other, when he's pressed about whether he holds an absolute position, he does not affirm that. Essentially, he then will acknowledge that in certain circumstances, and both of these wars present that, there is room for resistance to aggression, and resistance to aggression can involve the use of force and the use of lethal force, but it must be restrained and limited. So Francis has his own version of how he shapes the Catholic position. He has taken a very strong position on nuclear weapons, arguing that the possession of nuclear weapons is itself a sin. He has a very strong critique of deterrence as a strategy for negotiating the nuclear age. He does not feel it is a position that should be espoused. So he has carved out a position along the spectrum. So here we come then to this third position. The just war position is the one I will use. Why do I use it? I think it provides a range of ideas, principles, and rules that are broad enough to deal with the complexity of war, including modern war. So let me say a little bit more about what this moral framework is, since it is the one that, in my life anyway, I have found to be the most satisfactory moral answer to a world where war is possible. A word about history. This position finds its early statement in the writings of St. Augustine. And so Augustine's great book, The City of God, written in 430, is the beginning of this argument. It continues through the Middle Ages, where it finds its clearest exposition, not its only, but its clearest exposition in Thomas Aquinas. And then in the 16th and 17th centuries, when war between modern states takes shape, in the 16th and 17th century, we find a body of thought called the Spanish scholastics, who adapted just war teaching to modern warfare. In the 20th century, it was the dominant position up through, I would say, Pope John Paul II, who himself, while using it, wanted to limit its scope. And as I say, Francis has defined his own position. So what does this just war position do? Well, it begins with a presumption against the use of force. In other words, while it acknowledges that some uses of force are morally acceptable, it begins a position that says we ought not to resort to force, its first response. But then it argues that it is possible that circumstances are such, and essentially circumstances where justice is being broadly violated, where life is being unjustly taken, it argues that you can override the presumption against the use of force and carve out a limited set of ideas, principles, and rules that are meant to govern the use of force. So you start with a presumption against the use of force, and then you try to develop a set of conditions where that presumption is overridden, and the judgment in that case is this is a situation where the use of force is morally acceptable. How does that happen? How do you work out a justifiable use of military force? You ask and answer three questions. Why can force be used? When can it be used? And how is force to be used? In other words, you have to meet those conditions to argue you are in a position that it is now time where the use of military force by a state, for example, is justifiable. So the why question, for what purpose may lethal force be used in a moral way? The traditional answers have been you can use force to defend a state, you can use force to help another state who is being attacked. So defense is the first exceptional rule. In the past, force could be used for punishment. That is to say, you would punish the wrongdoer by submitting them to the use of force. And thirdly, in the past, it was argued that if a state had lost territory, had lost its standing by having been attacked, that the state could initiate war to retake what originally belonged to them. So defense, punishment, and retribution. Today, in Catholic thinking, the only justifiable use of force is defense of one's own nation or defense of others. And so the justification has been narrowed over time in the face of modern war. If you get to the point that you have, quotes, a just cause, then you ask the next set of questions. When can force be used? And here there are a series of categories. Is your cause just? Well, if it's defense of the state, of territories, of your own people, that cause is the justification. Secondly, it argues that the authority to use force in public affairs belongs to the state. And so not just anybody can decide they want to go to war if it is to be a morally acceptable war. Thirdly, there needs to be what's called right intention. What is it that drives one to take up the use of force? There are multiple intentions that one could think of, but the only intention that classifies as morally acceptable is to subdue evil and return to a state of security that one would call safety and security. Then the use of force must be proportionate. Not any and all use of force is acceptable even when you have a just cause. And finally, there needs to be a moral possibility of success. Even a state should not send its citizens to suicide. So these characteristics, and some of this will play out in the two wars we're looking at, these characteristics answer the when question. Why can you use force, defense? When can you use it? Those set of characteristics. And then the third question is how force is to be used, if it is to be used in a moral way. This question has become probably the dominant question that comes up whenever force can be used. And it is because the instruments of force, by the time you come through the 20th century, have so qualitatively expanded beyond what any other era had thought about, that the question of how force is to be used is the dominant question. You answer the question how force can be used in two steps. First of all, the directly intended, purposeful killing of civilians is always wrong and never to be justified. But all those adjectives count. That is to say, the directly intended, that the purpose of the attack is to kill civilians purposely. Directly intended, purposeful attack. So if someone says, I just saw in a film about a war where a military target was taken out by an air attack, and near that target was an apartment building, and civilians were killed. If the target was justifiable, if there was no other reasonable way to get at it, it is possible to say that the intent was to strike the target and not the civilians. But then you come to the second how question. How many civilians, in a sense, can be sacrificed in pursuing the use of force? So in class, I had a lot of military people in class. So I said, put yourself in the position that you're a commanding officer of a flight squadron. It's the middle of World War II. There's a tank factory in Germany that's turning out tanks left and right and killing the Western Allies. And so your operations officer comes in and says, this is the target, this is what we plan to do, this is why we're doing it. And the commanding officer is liable to say, it seems right to me. But the operations officer may say, sir, you need to know that around this tank factory is a kindergarten, a hospital, and a school. We'll do our best, but we can't guarantee that none of them will be hit. Now, what he's saying is we're not aiming at any civilians, but I can't guarantee to you that there'll be no civilians that will die. At that point, the second principle of proportionality kicks in. And you might argue that the target's legitimate, the proportional damage that is being done far exceeds the worth of the target, and therefore that target is not open to attack. This is the way it plays out in terms of civilian casualties, which, as you know, are very much in the debate, in all the debates about nuclear weapons, and in the debates of war that we're going to look at tonight. So those are just a framework to understand how to assess any kind of conflict. The two wars that we're looking at are different in their character and nature. The war between Ukraine and Russia is a conventional conflict. That is to say, it is very similar to World War I and World War II and Korea, except that it's a conventional conflict with 21st century technology. So while it is still a conventional conflict, the use of drones, missiles, high-powered artillery, and air power generally is part and parcel of conventional war today. In World War I, there was hardly any air power of significance. In World War II, there was resort to air power in a way that is important to tell you about as an example. So in World War II, beginning first with the Germans, but then being matched by the Western Allies, the strategy that was employed was the strategy that was called obliteration bombing. And obliteration bombing meant that when the opposing city was something you needed to take, there was no limits placed on that at all. And the interesting story about that was that in 1944, after the war had been going for over 4 years, a Jesuit who lived in Weston at the Weston School of Theology out in Weston at that time, Father John Ford. John Ford set himself to the task of analyzing the bombing policy of obliteration bombing. The article he produced at that time has been called the only classical article in American Catholic moral theology. It was an extraordinary piece of work. What he did was to take a figure who had acquired quite a reputation during World War II. He was a British military leader called Bomber Harris. And Bomber Harris had the strategy of obliteration bombing. Now, this was a strategy that the United States adopted also. And John Ford wrote a critique in 1944 in which he said, "I believe war can be justified. I believe this war is justified, and I believe that obliteration bombing is absolutely wrong and cannot be redeemed." Now, interestingly enough, within the last 15 years, there was a movement in England to build a statue to Bomber Harris, who was influential in the British planning of the war. And there was such a public outcry that they couldn't build the statue. But John Ford's article became one of sort of the lasting memory coming out of World War II, and it's used to this day. So these wars are both conventional conflicts pursued with 21st century technology. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is also an example of urban warfare. Urban warfare is the most difficult way to progress. It goes block by block, door by door, house by house. And those who carry it out, as well as those who are being attacked, are open to total vulnerability. Now, so both of these wars, Ukraine and the Middle East, are conventional conflicts fought with 21st century technology. The shadow of nuclear weapons stands behind both of them. In these two conflicts, nuclear weapons are not up front. They're not likely to be used, but they could be. So the shadow of nuclear weapons stands behind these two conventional conflicts. So before I turn to them, let me make one other remark, and that's about the political context in which we are living at this time in terms of international relations. And that is the return of great power politics. The phrase, the return of great power politics, is what scholars and journalists use to describe a shifting pattern of world politics that sets us off from the recent past, the period of time from the collapse of communism up till about 2015 or so. During that time, the classical model of great power politics was not highly visible. What do I mean by great power politics? Well, there are two different examples of it. One was an example that took shape in the 19th century and carried through the two world wars, and that was 5 or 6 major European powers were the dominant forces in world politics. England and Russia, France and Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. These were the major political forces of the time. That was one chapter in great power politics. It produced 2 world wars. The second chapter began in 1945 as the Second World War ended and continued up through the collapse of communism, and that was the Cold War model. The great powers were not 5, they were 2. There were 2 states that were set apart from everyone else, partly because of their economic and military power, and partly, eventually, because they possessed nuclear weapons. Now, when we talk about great power politics today, it's neither the 19th century version nor the Cold War version. Today, in world politics, what is taking shape is best understood as a series of concentric circles. The core circle in the middle is no longer 2 great powers, but 3 great powers: Russia, China, and the United States. So you have a triangular relationship. Why is that important? It's hard enough to manage the nuclear age when there are 2 powers that look each other in the eye every day and see the shadow and fear of nuclear weapons. Add a 3rd power to that, and the logic that guided us through much of the Cold War becomes much more complicated. Henry Kissinger, who was a master of the bipolar world, once said, when you put 3 great powers together, the question of who is deterring whom becomes harder to figure out. So that's the core. The next circle out are a series of emerging, but they have already emerged, major states who are not great powers, but they are the actors that include those in the wars we're examining. So here it's everything from the European states, Japan, but then to Iran, Israel, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, Pakistan. These are major powers, some of them nuclear powers, and they're in the second circle. And then the third circle becomes a pluralist community of multiplicity of states, international organizations, and institutions. So why do I bring up great power politics? Well, the 2 wars that we're looking at, for the most part, out of the 4 countries, 3 of them are not great powers, but the existence of great power politics sheds a shadow over the 2 wars we are looking at. And so it is important to keep that in mind because in both instances, in Ukraine and the Middle East, there is a constant fear of escalation from this conflict to something that could become a great power conflict. And a great power conflict would endanger the possibility of it being a nuclear conflict. So, as a context, I simply wanted to place that picture before you. Let's turn now to assessing the 2 wars from a moral perspective. First of all, they're comparable but not identical, to be sure. But the 2 of them, the war of Ukraine and Russia and Israel and Palestine, or Hamas and Israel, they share the following characteristics. Both of these wars have deep histories, and history matters in each case. There are memories here that drive people. There are hopes that have been held for centuries, or in this 20th and 21st century, a hope like the establishment of the country of Israel. these are powerful memories of how we got to where we are. Beyond deep histories, both of them were initiated by an invasion, and in each case, the invasion constituted an act of aggression judged in moral and legal terms. Thirdly, both of these conflicts have engaged the support of outside powers. Fourthly, both of these conflicts can easily expand horizontally throughout a region. And then finally, of the four countries involved, Ukraine, Russia, Israel, and Hamas, meaning Palestine, of the four countries, for three of them, these wars are what we would call an existential conflict. An existential conflict means that a state or a people feel that if they lose this war, they lose their identity and status in the world. So it tends to drive people to extreme positions. Now, in the case of Russia, no matter how they come out of the war in Ukraine, Russia will remain a major power. It is simply a fact. So for three of the four, these are existential conflicts. So in spite of these important similarities, the two wars differ in the nature of war that is being fought. So if you take the war of Russia and Ukraine, first of all, the war was initiated by an invasion by a great power. So of the three great powers in the world, one of them was involved in initiating the conflict in Ukraine. And this has consequences because it inevitably has drawn the United States close to the conflict, if not directly involved in it. And indeed, it is the threat of great power conflict that acts as a kind of restraint on policy. President Biden is constantly criticized for not providing certain kinds of weapons to the Ukrainians, weapons that would have the distance and scope to allow them to attack targets deep in Russia. He doesn't do that because he fears that's the first step to direct U.S. and Russian conflict. So there, in Ukraine, it is invasion by a great power, and again, a conventional war with 21st century technology. Now, one general commented on this war early on, and unfortunately his comment is probably being realized. General Milley, who was chief of the United States forces in toto, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said early on, this kind of war, Ukraine and Russia, could look a lot like World War I, a war in which powers come to be stymied against each other. There's a lot of killing, a lot of dying, and there's not much movement. And it is, in World War I, it was trench warfare, and basically people who study these kinds of things hoped we would never go back to that again, because it seemed like such a waste. But that, in fact, is what is to some degree reflected already in the war in the Ukraine. The Russian invasion was stalled. The Ukrainian counter response stalled, and at the moment people are dying left and right, but not much movement is being made. The Israel-Palestine war is an invasion not by a great power, but by a group that is not recognized at all in international law, not recognized as a sovereign state. It is classified by some, including the United States, as a terrorist insurgency. The war that is being fought, as I indicated, in many ways is urban warfare. Certainly when you're going into tunnels under the ground with a single line of soldiers confronting another single line because there's only room for one line in these tunnels, you are down to the worst aspects of urban warfare. Dangerous with high degree of casualty. The Israelis have lost over 200 soldiers already. That in Israel is a catastrophe because of the size of the country. So in many ways, they're two different wars. How do you then bring a moral analysis to these two? Let's start with Ukraine and Russia. So what I'm going to be doing is reaching back to what I gave you in those ideas of what constitutes moral judgment on war and seeing how at least some of them take place in each of these. To do a full-scale analysis of the morality of these wars is worth a semester, so I don't want to oversell the product here. This is to give you a snapshot of a complicated and tragic situation. So Ukraine and Russia begins in February of 2020. We are looking at the second anniversary next month, and it begins with the fact of Russian invasion. That invasion clearly constituted an aggression in moral and legal terms. So what was it that drove one of the three great powers in the world to begin a war that is on its face, even if it is not that in the mind of Mr. Putin, that on its face is clearly a moral violation of an aggression? Well, Mr. Putin is driven by a memory and a vision. His memory, as he has stated it, is that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of communism. So that's an in-principle statement for him, that it wasn't just a way of organizing the economy. It was much more than that, that the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century was the collapse of communism. The vision that he holds is that the reestablishment of the Russian imperial tradition is possible. And he wants to reestablish Russian imperial control on surrounding areas that surround Russia. And then the question becomes, was his vision just a mistake, or is his vision short-sighted? Well, in fact, there's been a debate in the West of whether the West, in a sense, sparked a fair amount of fear in Mr. Putin. One of the preeminent diplomats of the 20th century for the United States was George Kennan, ambassador to Russia, historian of Russia. Kennan said that the language that said that we might incorporate Ukraine into NATO, certainly into the European community, and maybe into NATO, was perhaps the worst foreign policy mistake of the post-World War II era. Other people powerfully dispute this argument and say that it wasn't fear of NATO, but the inner drive of Mr. Putin's policy that brought him to this invasion. So an evaluation of the invasion, in terms of just war terms, the invasion lacks just cause. In other words, it lacks the overriding judgment you have to make that this situation is such that use of force is absolutely necessary. It doesn't override the presumption against the use of war, against the presumption against going to war. As a sovereign state, Russia had the right to use force, but only under certain circumstances. And those circumstances were violated when aggression, which means a military attack across an internationally recognized border, that's what aggression basically means, that is what occurred. Now, what happens in just war thought is when someone violates just cause, it creates a set of rights on the other side by those who have been violated. So the lack of a just cause on behalf of Russia creates in Ukraine the right of self-defense. So once again, if you have to override the presumption against the use of force by giving reasons of why you're doing that, an aggression creates in the victim the right of self-defense. So the Ukrainians, by definition, have just cause in defending against the attack. Now, at the same time, the right of self-defense is not an absolute right. It provides the basis to take up arms and defend, but it must be done within limits. It must be done within limits. So the right of self-defense gives a nation the permission to respond with force, but the question about how they respond, and this will come up in the next war even more powerfully, how they respond is then where the other questions come in. If you have the right of self-defense, are you going to exercise it with proportion or not? If you have the right of self-defense, does that mean that the idea that civilians are no longer protected? That doesn't come with the right of self-defense. And the other question that has to be asked, even in defense, is this possible? Can you successfully carry out defense? And that becomes a question when a war stymies and the killing goes on and no one seems to get anywhere. And so one of the questions that the Ukrainians will face is the question of proportionality. Now, when we talk about proportionality in moral terms, we mean two things. One, the use of force that is morally justified should be proportioned to the threat that is before you. In other words, thinking of going to nuclear war because your country had been invaded would clearly violate proportionality. But proportionality also means what kinds of weapons you use. And again, I go back to the point, it's not a political point, it's a moral point, that Biden has come under critique for not providing certain kinds of weapons to the Ukrainians. And there's a case there that those weapons would be more effective. But the other case is it could be disproportionate since it's another step up the ladder. Now, along with the fact that as Ukrainians respond to Russia, they need to do it with some proportion, there is the question of moral possibility of success. Very difficult question to decide. But what lies behind the question is good statecraft means that you don't send your people into a suicidal situation. Right away, people will bring up historical examples where a nation seemed not to have a chance to defend themselves, but they did. And so the question of who decides what's morally possible has to rest in the first instance with those who are under attack. But if you have the right to self-defense, it needs to be done with proportion, and it needs to at least have about it moral possibility of success. So where are the Ukrainians today? The Russian invasion has been stymied but not defeated. Ukraine has been impacted but not defeated. The question that is likely to arise, I think, is when you move from war to diplomacy, from war to negotiation. The president of Ukraine has said that his objective is every inch of sovereign territory that belongs to Ukraine. It means Crimea, which the Russians took in 2014, and the world sort of let it happen, but it means every inch of territory that is within Ukraine's boundaries. The question that will rise, perhaps, is that a disproportionate objective? Is it an objective that likely cannot be realized? And if you hold out from that as your negotiating position, are you in a position where lives will be taken and lost on both sides, but the basic position won't change very much? I don't know whether that will be the situation, but I think that is a possibility that the proportionality question will be asked in terms of not how the war is fought, but how the peace is negotiated. So to summarize, partial summarize the case, the invasion is clear, the right of self-defense is clear, but limited in terms of strategy and tactics. Proportionality can be defended so far, but whether it will be sustained is another question. Let's turn to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Here, once again, history matters. This conflict has biblical proportions. The ancestors of these people reach way, way back, and we can read about them in the Hebrew Scriptures. So it has, as I pray the Psalms in the office these days, it does strike me where Israel is calling on God to protect them in a dangerous world. It must resonate in a certain way. But about the conflict, once again, the conflict's initiated by Hamas's invasion. Hamas lacks standing. Russia, when they carried out the invasion, did it as a sovereign state who sits in the Security Council of the United Nations, whose definition is protected in their identity. Hamas has none of that. They do not have standing as a state, and therefore, in the first instance, this is a different kind of situation. You can press it further. Hamas's objective is the destruction of Israel. So they are very clear that nothing short of the destruction of Israel will satisfy their view of what the future requires. Remember that I said for these parties, this kind of war is an existential concern. Both sides worry about whether their identity and their existence will be possible at the end of the conflict. So there is no standing for Hamas. Their objective is really not a proportional objective in any sense of the term, to totally destroy a nation. And their methods in the invasion were barbaric. 1,200 killed, 240 hostages. So the question before I move to Israel is, well, what about the argument that all of this is about the fact that the Palestinians once lived in all of Palestine, and then the Jewish state was formed in 1948 with the support of the United Nations and with the crucial support of the United States? Could Hamas make an argument that they have just cause because of that history? This is an argument that is made. And so then the question becomes, how does one think of this? There certainly are historical examples where territory has been taken from a people taken from a state, and at a later date, an argument gets made, we have the right of, in a sense, retribution to retake the territory. But in terms of world order today, one can acknowledge historical injustices in the past, and one can try to find diplomatic and other ways to resolve them. There was resolution of territorial disputes in Europe after World War II. And the proposal of a two-state solution in Palestine would be precisely this attempt at a diplomatic solution to what has happened. But to argue that you can destroy another state is not permissible. And furthermore, in world order terms today, while diplomatic and legal possibilities of accommodations of the past can be made, it doesn't constitute a just cause for the right to go to force. Again, the invasion creates the right of self-defense for Israel. But again, the right must be exercised within limits. This is the way this moral theory works. It gives you permission to act, and then it draws around you a set of limitations. That's why I actually think it is the best way to try to think about this difficult problem of human beings killing each other over territory, security, and standing. You get a right, but you must exercise it within limits. No question that the Israelis had the right of self-defense after the invasion by Hamas. But there are questions about how the Israelis have pursued that objective. It is clear from the amount of power they have brought to bear in very confined areas that non-combatant immunity must have been violated, and proportionality also by this time has been violated. This does not mean the Israelis have to cease and desist right this minute. I think that's an overstatement, although I'll come back to Pope Francis in just a moment. But I do think that the exercise of the right has gone beyond the boundaries of the how question, directly intended killing of civilians. Now, right there, I have to stop. The Israelis put lots of emphasis in we try to avoid killing civilians. I believe they can demonstrate that, and so I am not contesting it. But when you look at the question of how you exercise the use of force, you have to look at intention, planning, targeting, outcome, and see if you can learn. And I think at this stage, one can support Israel's right to respond and criticize how the response has been made. Those two case study has to be in quotes. Neither of them are complete. Both of them are meant to try to illustrate a modern scene where we're trying to contain conflicts of major proportion and long history. I want to say a word now about not those conflicts over there, but the domestic consequences of these wars in the United States. The consequences have differed. In the war of Ukraine versus Russia, there have been strong support for Ukraine from the beginning, in policy, in funding for military and humanitarian assistance, and in political support. There were memories of the Cold War that feed easily into this, strange again, Russia and its neighbors. And as the war progressed to a stalemate, which it is at right at the present time, that initial support possibly is going to be challenged. It's challenged in the Congress at the present time, I think, in a particularly unfortunate way, that there is one piece of legislation that would provide funding for Israel, funding for Ukraine, and funding for dealing with immigration here in the United States. And because you can't get agreement in the Congress on the money for immigration and its purposes, all three of them are held up. So there is, at this moment, doubt about whether particularly funding for Ukraine will go forward. So at this moment, in terms of our own country, there had been a commitment to support the Ukrainians. The war is still going on, and the question about whether there'll be a sustaining vote for that commitment. Israel and Palestine. This war has fed back into our country in a way that I find disturbing. I contrast it with Vietnam. Certainly we had huge conflicts about Vietnam in the United States, but it was sort of the popular opinion versus the government. What's happened in this conflict is it feeds back into religious, ethnic relationships, religious, ethnic groups. It sets us against each other as we try to figure out what a responsible policy is for the future. There is no question that before the war there already were serious signs of anti-Semitism had reoccurred in the American public. And since the war, that anti-Semitism has increased. This is a blot on our country and needs to be addressed in its own terms. It is also the case that Palestinians and Arab populations have suffered their own form of discrimination, again exacerbated by the war. So if you remember the case in Vermont where 3 young men wearing keffiyeh were shot on a street in a college town. So it has fed back into our country. To my mind, this is a highly disturbing situation. We as a mature democratic country ought to have the capacity to conduct ourselves in a complicated world, as we inevitably will be called upon to do, and to be able at the same time to carry on a rational, civilized discussion about our policies and our purposes. At this time, that challenge is not being met. And so let me say one word about the Catholic community. It's always good to sort of locate ourselves. So Catholic-Jewish relations since Vatican II have just escalated in a wonderful way. All the old discussions about Christ killers and all of that went out the window, and we have formed powerful relationships. Several in this parish will know that I've said several times that when immigrants started to come to the United States and Massachusetts in large numbers, I got a call from one of the leading figures in the Jewish community in Boston. And he said, "We know what this is like. We remember when the doors were closed and there was no place to go." And he said, "We don't have much of an organization to deal with immigrants, but we know how to raise money." And he said, "If you do the organizing, we'll raise the money." They raised over $500,000 for us. We have ties there. We also, as Catholics, have deep ties with the Palestinian community. There was an organization set up at the end of World War II called the Pontifical Mission for Palestine. It's based in New York City, but it's a Vatican institution. And there's a second organization called the Catholic Near East Welfare Association that's dedicated to the care of Palestinians and Arab population. So we're in a position where we need to keep the ties of our community and contribute to a better advancement of civility and dialogue. So let me make two sets of final comments. First, Pope Francis and the two wars. As I said, I feel he has located himself between pacifism and just war as theories, moral theories. His emphasis is always on the value of peace. As he puts it, war is always a defeat. His stress is always on resisting any kind of the use of force. And so then, in light of the history of Catholic thought, people raise questions. Diplomacy and ambassadors raise questions. I thought Catholicism thought some use of force was justifiable. When he's pressed that way, and he was by the Ukrainians first, and then by the Jewish Foreign Office of the Jewish government, of the Israeli government, when he's pressed, then he acknowledges that some use of force is permissible. In his address to the diplomatic corps, which is an annual event in January, he just talked about the criteria of just war. But that's been his position on war. He then complements that with a highly activist diplomacy, not his judgment on war, but meeting with Jewish and Palestinian groups who have suffered from the war. And in Ukraine and Russia, his constant effort are to try to overcome the religious dimension that is built into that war, because the Orthodox Church is a great supporter of the Russian government, and Francis wants to keep the church free from any single government. So he has carved out a distinctive place. Final point, U.S. policy. The U.S. is in these two conflicts. There is no way in which we will be divorced from them in just an accidental way. It's going to take policy. So the strong support for Ukraine, I think, was always right. The effort to avoid escalation in a world of great power politics is an absolutely right idea. And the idea is that to walk away from the support we have already committed to would be, I think, a serious mistake for the country and for others. In the Israeli-Palestinian question, the initial support for Israel was total. That's President Biden. He came into life as a Democrat in the union movement. That was always tied to Israel. Except today, the unions are divided over support for Israel. There's some division because of the methods. But in any case, the initial total support was understandable. But as time has gone along, the U.S. has tried to restrain the way in which the Israeli government is exercising its right of self-defense. So the effort to contain this war from spreading regionally into an interstate war in the Middle East is the other side of U.S. policy, and it is the right thing to do. None of this will send you home with answers. I just hope I didn't send you home with any contradictions. But that was the best I could do with these two wars. I will take questions if people have them. It's 10 past. It's 10 past 8. I'll have you out at 8:20.
Is it on? Father Bryan, thank you very much for putting those historical frameworks in perspective. Um, I guess, I don't know if you've reflected on this, but if you were called upon to maybe find some sort of resolution to both wars as an advisor, would there be some sort of resolution you think that is possible for both wars going on today? Resolutions. For both the Ukrainian war and the war in the Middle East. Resolutions with, yeah.
Way that diplomacy has not yet taken over. My recommendation is that you simply can't have Russia take over part of Ukraine in the way it has without any resistance. That doesn't mean that a negotiated settlement would necessarily be what the president of Ukraine wants at the present minute. And the Israeli-Palestinian question has to move beyond where we've been since 1948. And so the present Israeli government's position that there'll never be a Palestinian state, I think is a mistake, and I think lots of the Jewish community there and here, from what I sense, believe that. So my sense is that once again, in both cases, a diplomacy that maybe nobody gets everything they want is the best resolution in both counts.
Father, I'll have to stand right there so we don't miss you. Who's next?
That's called strategy.
Okay. Father, I think one of the things you didn't touch on, and it's such an enormous topic, is the war isn't really with the Palestinians. It's with a proxy for Iran and really a proxy for Islam versus the Western world. And I don't know if that's too much to answer or talk about, but the Palestinians are really pawns in the game.
That's okay. Pete's point is that the Palestinians are really a pawn in the game of, it's not really about Palestinians, it's about a proxy for Palestine.
Well, that's true. I wanted to be careful about that. You should not identify Hamas with all Palestinians. On the other hand, you will get some Palestinians that say you can't not identify. The Palestinians are a political authority, a military force, and a social service agency. So it's a tricky move. I think by all means, two bishops in the United States took a position last week on the war in the Middle East, Bishop McElroy and Bishop Wester. And they both, I think, rightly said that Hamas has excluded themselves from the negotiation because of their intention to wipe out Israel and because of their method. So, but there's got to be a Palestinian voice, and right this minute, that's hard to find. Represent all the Palestinians, but in terms of the military force, they are the armed wing that carried out the invasion. That's for sure. That's for sure. But the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is something else entirely. So Hamas is a representative or unrepresentative group of the Palestinians, depending on who you talk to. So they are the military force, but they are not necessarily the Palestinians.
I'm going to take one more.
Yeah, Peter.
So you're going to say it, and then I'm going to say it again. Yes. Back at the beginning of your speech, you talked about morality of war, and who should go in, and when they should go in, and why they
The question how wars start is worth a long discussion. The longer you'll be happy to know we're not going to have it. I think you have to get to the specifics in each case. I think Mr. Putin has a plan, and going into Ukraine met the plan. Hamas had a plan. I don't think it's justified, as I don't think Putin's was, but you can figure out why they did what they did. So, but the way oftentimes wars start by mistakes. They start without a grand plan, but a narrow vision that leads one down a path it's hard to retreat from. So I think I need to let you go home, or it's going to be disproportionate if I don't. So. Thank you.